session will begin in 1 minute.
Better in 1 minute than 20 minutes.
Yes, I hope that this is not repeating itself. The next 1 hour. Welcome, everybody, to this session of the 2021 Atlantic Dialogues, organized by the Policy Center for the New South. The title of our session today is The Future of Europe in the Post-COVID Geopolitical Arena. And I would like to start by highlighting two salient features of this session. First, we are still not in the post-COVID geopolitical arena. We are in the middle of the 6th or 5th or 4th wave, depending on which countries. And on the other hand, this session and the Atlantic Dialogues are convened by the Policy Center for the New South, which is a think tank based in Morocco, endeavoring to develop the global South and African perspective of international global issues. And in my opinion, this somehow reflects the fact that Europe matters. Whatever the analysis on the diminishing geopolitical power of Europe, on the limited capacity to project itself to the rest of the world, at least for the global South and for many of their countries, Europe is still a very important actor in the geopolitical arena. For discussing this issue, we have two eminent speakers, which are somehow very complementary to each other, because one is an analyst and the other one is rather a practitioner. First, we have Thomas Gomard, who is the director of the Institut Français des Relations Internationales, and who has actually developed a career at the IFRI as an analyst of geopolitical issues, focused for a long time on post-Soviet space, but more wider in European geopolitics. And to this extent, he's a very qualified analyst to our topic. Two of his last two books deal with Europe as a subject or an object of geopolitics of data. This is very relevant today. Europe as an object or a subject of geopolitics of pandemic, of the COVID-19. And secondly, well, I would translate it as a whirlwind of the world, the 10 main global geopolitical challenges. And this is one of the issues we are going to discuss today. As director of the IFRI, Mr. Gomard is also responsible for the Ramses annual yearbook, and he's also part of the editorial board of Politique Étrangère, which are two major publications related to the topics we are discussing today. The second speaker is Ambassador Alessandro Minuto Rizzo, who is presently the president of the NATO Defense College Foundation. He has formerly been for 6 years, between 2001 and 2007, Deputy Secretary General of the NATO, and formerly also Italian Ambassador to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union. And to this extent, as practitioner, he has probably a hands-on approach to the geopolitical implications of the current pandemic crisis. And he has also, for a while, been in charge of NATO relations with Southern Mediterranean countries and Gulf countries. Actually, one of his last books deals precisely with the partnership between the NATO and the Middle East countries. And to this extent, his expertise is very relevant as well for the topic we are analyzing today from a southern perspective. And I am Ivan Martin. I'm senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and I will just try to facilitate and make easier the interaction between our two speakers. Before giving the floor to them, allow me to frame a little bit our discussion today. Our main endeavor actually is to take stock of the first 2 years of the Geopolitical Commission of the European Union. This formula used by President Ursula von der Leyen in her first speech in front of the European Parliament to request the voting as President of the European Commission, this Geopolitical Commission somehow indicated the willingness to put the projection of Europe to the rest of the globe, of the world, at the center of the action of the European Commission. However, what we have seen in these 2 years of this Commission so far is far from this Geopolitical Commission, to the extent that if we look at the main drivers of European integration in these 2 years, one would have to mention Brexit, no doubt. This somehow triggered a whole transformation of the European Union. The struggling with border management and migration, and the difficulties to bring forward a European agenda on migration is another one of the key elements, but very much internal in nature. The reaction and response to the pandemic, this prompted the adoption of the budget for 2021 and 2027 of the European Union. In parallel, the recovery fund for up to 1 trillion euros was adopted, which entailed a major rethinking of how Europe responded to a crisis. But in terms of global projection, actually the funds for external action of the European Union were basically frozen at roughly 1 billion euros over the 7 years period, which was practically the same amount that for the 7 years before. And then in the last months, we have seen how the main internal confrontation in the European Union over the rule of law, in particular in some new member countries like Hungary or like Poland, is polarizing the political discussion rather than the global projection of the European Union. And when we look at the contents of the ongoing conference on the future of Europe that the European Commission launched in 2020, we also see that internal issues tend to be prominent rather and prevailing in the discussions rather than discussions on the role of Europe in the global geopolitical arena. Just to conclude, there are a new development, though, which is worth mentioning, which is the presentation and public discussion in the last couple of weeks, I think it was 10 days ago, of the EU strategic compass presented by the High Representative for the external European security policy, and the prospect of building an embryo, I would say, of European armed force. They speak of 5,000 soldiers able to be displayed in specific crisis situations. And of course, the whole discussion led by France on the strategic autonomy of Europe. It is very interesting to see how this term of strategic autonomy has somehow evolved from a purely security and defense meaning to a more economic meaning related to global value chains and the nearshoring of key and crucial economic sectors for the European economy. So I think this is the framework that will somehow guide our discussions. and I won't take more time from the speakers, so we can go for a first round of interventions. First, Monsieur Gomard, and then Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, and then we can go for a more dynamic exchange between the three of us. So please, Monsieur Gomard, you have the floor now. Thank you. On your first thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my real pleasure to participate in this Atlantic dialogue and to have this discussion with Ambassador Minuto Rizzo. As you know, it's very important for IFRI to participate in this Atlantic dialogue, given the very strong links that we developed now since many years with the Policy Center for New South Thoughts. It's also a way for me to say hello to the whole team. I would argue, to put things very bluntly and to start to some extent the debate with Alessandro, that in my opinion, the question for the EU is less to become a geopolitical actor than to be a geo-economic actor. I will start with that because I do think that for traditional diplomacy or for defense and security in real terms, it's very difficult for the EU to exist by itself for many reasons on which I could elaborate after. But on the other hand, I think that the EU is taken very seriously everywhere in the world when it is about climate and energy, when it is about trade, or hopefully when it is about technology. So my initial point is, given the structure of the EU, this very complicated, in fact, interaction between state members, the Commission, the Parliament, and so on, it can be misleading if we think, I would say, in a French way, and to think about Europe puissance, Europe as a power, because in my opinion, it is misleading to expect that the EU could act like the US, China, or even Russia, Turkey, and other players. For different reasons, I have no time to list right now. But as I said, I think that the EU has an influence, can have a leadership when it is about the three topics I have previously listed. So that's the argument. Now, if I try to go further, maybe four brief points. The very first one, it is the analysis we can make about this ongoing, as you said rightly, Ivan, sanitary crisis, which is not ending, unfortunately, but there are already some visible consequences of this crisis. The very first one, it is, in my opinion, this crisis is a techno-sanitary crisis. What does it mean? It is sanitary for its causes, its main causes, but its main consequences are technological. The transformation, in since now almost 2 years, in terms of ruling, in terms of working, in terms of interacting, are dramatically changing everywhere. And that's created a situation in which, to some extent, digital platforms are more and more than before, at the center of obviously the economic activities, but more and more at the center of the political activities, to put things too quickly. The second visible consequence is about, the redistribution of power. It is also a point you have attached in your introduction, Ivan, and a change of perception toward China, especially in Europe. There was, this so-called wolf diplomacy promoted by China. At that time, it was still the Trump administration. We have now the Biden administration, which is more polite, but at the same time, still very strong on different issues in its relation with Europe. But for sure, for Europe, this crisis was very, very challenging. At the beginning, there was a deep crisis within the EU, the fact that the borders were closed, the fact that the initial reaction were very, very national. But to put things quickly, almost 2 years after, what was done by the EU, it's not nothing in terms of the recovery plan, in terms of the coordination of vaccination plan. To some extent, the EU by the end of November 2021 is stronger than the EU in March 2020, in my opinion, with this crisis. The third consequence is about the gap between, in terms of vaccination, between advanced economies and other countries. And for the dialogue we have with the PCNS, it's something on which we are very often focused, because this difference in terms of vaccination, as I said, have created, a new gap in terms of inequalities, global inequalities, and the globalization, to put things very largely, the globalization was justified by its ability to reduce inequalities, or to put things in other words, to take away from poverty large amount of people. And this dynamic is now in question. It's no more the case, because the crisis and its economic consequences is very, very detrimental for country in development. But leads me to the second point I wanted to make about the landscape. If we try to broaden the landscape in which we are, and not to speak only about Europe, I do think that we face a convergence between two trends. The very first one, it is the environmental degradation, with three main elements: global warming, loss of biodiversity, pollutions. That's something which is now more and more at the core of many public policies, but also all the, I would say, business model of big companies are transforming by that. And also there is a demand coming from the population, especially coming from the youth, to try to deal with this environmental degradation. And on the other hand, you have a sort of technological propagation. The fact that more and more the technology is an instrument of empowerment, of individual empowerment, but also of hyper concentration of power in a few hands with the digital platforms. And that creates a situation which is, in my view, read differently in Europe, in China, and in the US. In China and the US, you have this idea that the second trend will be the response to the first one. This idea that thanks to technology, to some extent, the environmental degradation will be dealt with. And that's certainly something which is thought in different ways in Europe. I can try later to elaborate on that. The third point is about, you know, the different documents or the different initiatives you have mentioned, Ivan. The fact that the EU, Europe, is more and more convinced that it is playing in a hyper-competitive world. To some extent, if you read the first document related to the strategic compass, you have this very clear idea that Europe is in danger, that the threats are not only military or territorial, but are coming from other fields, and that there is a risk of strategic shrinking for Europe. And that leads European authorities to say security cannot be addressed as business as usual. There is something new which should be taken into consideration. And I think that the main difference between China, Europe, and the US on this particular point, it is the fact that less and less, in my opinion, there is in China and the US a clear separation between what is civilian and what is military. This distinction is still very visible in the European way of thinking, in the European way of working, but it is less and less obvious in the two big countries I have mentioned. That leads me to the final point. It is that more and more Europe has to deal with, I would say, counter models. To some extent, you know, Europe was able to promote its model of a political prototype, and it was something followed very carefully in different regions in the world. But now, to some extent, the EU as a political entity is more and more criticized. The fact that, you know, my initial background is in Russia, maybe give me some elements to think in this way. But even if for Russia right now the EU is no more credible, you have this feeling that in its relation with China, in its relation with the US to some extent, the EU as itself, I would say, is more and more challenged. Of course, Brexit was an important step in this process. So that leads to the final point about this situation, that, you know, the EU, in my opinion, should think about its own cohesion, because there are difference of trends within the EU. We could be back on that later. And the question is certainly to continue to promote multilateralism, which is something on which the EU can deal with many countries or which do not want to be trapped, to put things bluntly, by the rivalry between China and the US. Having said that, it's also very important to note that I think that since the 2 years in which we were asked to think, to some extent, the transatlantic relation was reinforced, especially in the technological field. And I stop there to continue the discussion later.
Thank you, Mr. Gomart. Very enlightening first approach to the issue. And it is interesting that you underline that Europe is stronger now than it was 2 years ago, but at the same time, there are increasingly cohesion problems within it, which both things are quite clear, I think, and somehow contradictory. And on the other hand, at the multilateral level, it is also quite interesting. I'm happy that you raised this issue at the end. It is also quite obvious, I would say, that a global challenge as the pandemic has not managed actually to reinforce multilateral responses. I think so far, this is very clearly the situation. This can, of course, evolve. Maybe we can take these issues in the later discussion. Now we move on to Ambassador Minuto Riccio. So the floor is yours, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. Well, reflecting on the issues that you are asking us to comment today, in fact, the more you think about that, the larger the scenario is, because you are asking about, on the one hand, about COVID and the developments of COVID and the influence of the multilateral system, but in fact, you started speaking about a geopolitical commission. I mean that by the word commission, you mean Europe, probably, not commission in technical term. I suppose you mean Europe. So perhaps we should start from there, because it is also, of course, an important question mark to see if we want to have in the future more of a geopolitical Europe, or, as Professor said before, more of a geoeconomic. It is, of course, a very open discussion, and of course, it may be declined in various ways, and depending also on the timing. If you speak about geopolitics, if we start, then it means security. If we look at Europe from this point of view, I think that we have to remember always that security, which is in fact foreign policy and defense, came very late into the, let's say, into the European agenda, very late. At the beginning, the EEC, as it was called, and then became the European Union, was really focusing on economics, on an internal market, on agriculture, and later developed other technical issues, let's say. So security, if you speak about, again, foreign policy and defense, came into the picture only with the Maastricht Treaty, which is very late. It is 1992, if I remember correctly. This is the first time where you have some vague sentence there speaking about, the possibility for the Union to have an active role in those areas. And I spoke with some of the people who were present in Maastricht and say that they were very uncertain if to put even those vague words inside or not. So we start from there. Then we have the Amsterdam Treaty in 1997, if I'm right, where you have a possible competence for the European Union into the so-called Petersberg Task, which is in fact peacekeeping. And then in this treaty in the December 2000, where you have more of a discussion of foreign policy or policy and defense. I remember very well that period because I was the founding member of the Political and Security Committee, and we were really starting from zero. In fact, it was a French initiative of President Chirac to promote permanent bodies in Brussels. There was nothing of that kind before. And so we had to invent a little bit in which direction to go. It is interesting, I mean, from a think tank point of view, from an intellectual point of view, it is interesting, perhaps also political, it is interesting to remember that the ambitions at the time were high, much higher, in fact, than we think today. Because don't forget that we had the Kosovo campaign against Serbia and Milosevic, and where, in that respect, European powers, all of them, proved to be very short of the technological tools they needed to have really an incident on the campaign. So in fact, 90% of the campaign was dealt with by the American Air Force, in fact. And so I remember very well that in that moment, in that period, the call for European cohesion in that respect was very much about what we call capabilities. Capabilities, I remember capabilities, and everybody agreed on that. I remember very well that at the Nice summit, I was present there in the year 2000, the decision was to have what was called at the time with an English word, I don't know how you translate it in French, headline goal. In other words, it meant to have about 60,000 people who were able to be deployed long distance in 2 months and to operate as an expeditionary force full strength. It has not been the case then about the implementation of this decision. So what happened afterwards is that the European Union developed very much in terms of institutions. You have the foreign service, the external service in the Lisbon Treaty. You have a strong improvement in the figure of the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Defense. You have a lot of building up in institutions, but without, let's say, a correspondence in terms of operations, of doing things. So now, at this moment when we speak, we can say that we have in Europe, all the tools that we need to have a geopolitical Europe. But of course, the tools are not sufficient. You need the political will to do that. And of course, you need a design, you need an objective, you need the destination somehow, which is discussed now. So this is where the European Union has developed in terms of security and defense and foreign policy. We have only very minor operations so far. And this is not, in discussion. If you take NATO, on the other hand, it is a very different kind of animal. And in fact, it is agreed by everybody that up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was really NATO in charge of European security. So, you have also to remember that part of the coin, the other side of the coin. Of course, with different policies, General de Gaulle had his own ideas, but more or less, let's say there was a united West towards the Soviet Union. NATO, of course, is a completely different animal from the European Union because it is an alliance. Everybody forgets sometimes about this because the European Union has a supranational ambition, and I agree very much with that. It is very important. NATO, no. NATO is an alliance. It is a typical classical alliance, as we studied, when we were at school. The only difference is that it is an alliance which was founded in 1949 and it exists until today, which means that it has some added values because otherwise the countries would have left, this. So the Atlantic Alliance is much more an operational instrument. An operation is a civilian military organization, in this sense, civilian first, political first, and military afterwards, decided by consensus and being able of deploying and having real operations. Because you can remember Bosnia, Kosovo, Libya, we like it or not, Afghanistan, again, we like it or not, but certainly there were important operations at long distance made with important means and in a very serious way. So, when you speak about a geopolitical Europe, how you combine the two things. And of course, there are various ideas about that. And in my own country, in Italy, I think just yesterday or the day before yesterday, we had a very important agreement with France where there is some hint at declining this issue in the sense that we all are in favor of a strategic autonomy, at the same time keeping a link with the Atlantic Alliance and keeping the transatlantic bond. So this is a delicate balance there, and we don't know yet where we will go. But I think that, when you speak about the geopolitical Europe, you have to keep into mind that is not only what I said at the beginning in terms of development of its own institutions and tools, but also in terms of the relationship with the old Atlantic Alliance and the United States of America and Canada, which remains at the basis of is the other pillar of our security. So you see that Europe is in the middle of this scenario. Now, if you want to change, the discussion to speak about Europe, not from this point of view, but from the point of view of the citizens of Europe and the institutions of Europe, I personally think that COVID has been more a positive than a negative thing, in the sense that we all know, the specialists of this know, that health is not a European competence. It's not in the treaties, not so far at least. So, when, as the Professor Gomar rightly said at the beginning, there was a criticism of European institutions, it was not well placed simply because these European institutions had no competence over that. They had to build their own competence. And they have, in a way. You can discuss again, how much, 80%, 70%. I think they have shown that it is a good way to deal with things, to have a European head. Because I think that the lesson that we take from COVID is a double lesson. And it is, how can I say, extremely difficult to interpret. Because on one hand, you have fragmentation being the rule of the game. And if we read the newspapers every day, it's fragmentation. I don't need to go into that, from New Zealand to United States, to Italy, to France, fragmentation, to Morocco, they closed, I understand, the flights from a certain country, fragmentation. But on the other hand, we understand that is a global issue to be tackled globally. So you have a contradictory experience there. When COVID will be over, where we will be, I don't know. I think that in the end, the globalized view will prevail. It will prevail also because it is connected with other things, which is not only the pandemic, and we have spoken about that in the past couple of months a lot, in Rome and in Glasgow, climate change being, universally recognized already as a priority, tackled in different ways, but a priority for everybody. So if you take the nexus between health and security, and on the other hand, climate change and security, you see that we go in the direction of a more global world. Of course, I think, a global world which is not based on, an economic advantage of rich countries against the poor, and not, of simply multinationals deploying to poor countries only because the labor is cheaper. No, I don't think in that terms. I hope that globalization should take place on a joint exercise as much as it is possible, with the limits, of course, of it, around a few global issues. So I will perhaps end here, trying to, as I say, to move in parallel. On the one hand, what you call the geopolitical Europe and what it means in the world, and on the other hand, Europe after the COVID. Perhaps the last thing, and here I agree with Professor Gomar, I don't think that Europe can become a great power in terms of, of force, power, a big army. I don't think so. It will probably be more important in terms of writing the rules, for instance. And it is certain that Europe is a very important, perhaps the most important soft power existing in the world. Because in the end of your, Mr. Martin, in the end of your points that you yesterday sent us by email, you also have something concerning Europe and the South. By the South, I suspect, meaning in Arab countries, Maghreb, etc., etc. Well, I think that Europe is doing a lot there, which is not recognized enough. Because the European Commission, and in this sense, I speak technically about the European Commission, is financing a lot of projects in all the Arab countries of North Africa without asking for nothing in return. There is no political price for that. It's just aid. And when I was a young Italian diplomat, speaking about 40 or 50 years ago, we still in Europe were supporting the Arab countries in different ways. But this is a direction where we should continue to go. It has not a political influence. Okay, this is true, and we have to work on that. But let's not forget that Europe, from an economic and development aid, has been very important for the South or the Mediterranean and for Africa. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm very happy that you concluded with this point, because this allows me to link to the next question for our discussion. Actually, both of you have gone into the same direction in your analysis. The Ambassador Minuto Rizzo mentioned that the ambitions of the European external and security policy are somehow diminished in relation to the early years of the policy, when you were creating the Political and Security Committee, and when in Maastricht the first sentences, and then in Lisbon the first actions on European security policy were developed. And Mr. Gomart, you have rightly indicated that one key lesson to be drawn from the EU strategic compass is that Europe feels threatened. And it is, as a consequence, it is taking a defensive approach. But at the same time, and you are fully right, Ambassador, at the same time, there are some also geopolitical considerations, like Europe is the first donor of development cooperation aid. You have mentioned that in your final point. Actually 50% of the global development cooperation aid is either by member states or by the European Union itself. The European Union as such, without member states, is the main and first global donor of humanitarian aid to cope with humanitarian emergencies. Europe is still perceived in many areas of the world as a kind of champion, and maybe not guarantor, but champion of democracy, even if the fight against irregular migration is somehow undermining, in some cases, this vision. And I would also say what you say, Europe is a major player in global rule writing. Regional integration processes worldwide are inspired by the European Union. Just to mention, in Latin America, in Africa, to a lesser extent in Asia as well, they are inspired, like ASEAN, in the experience of the European Union. And this has a value, a geopolitical value, soft power, but geopolitics as well for the European Union. My question here to both of you would be how this apparent contradiction between the feeling of threat and the diminished ambitions on the one hand, and this prominent role in soft power worldwide, in development aid, humanitarian aid, real writing, will affect the relations of Europe, on the one hand, the European Union in particular, with Africa and the southern Mediterranean countries, which are now redefining their relations to the European Union in the framework of the EU-Africa partnership, in the framework of the new approach or new Mediterranean agenda of the European Union. And on the other hand, on the transatlantic relations, you have mentioned, Thomas, that they have somehow improved or been strengthened over the last 2 years of the pandemic. But I would like both of you, also the ambassador is a fine connoisseur of the American-European relations. So I would both of you like I would like you both of you to elaborate on how this situation will affect relations to Southern Mediterranean and African countries, relation to or transatlantic relations. Maybe we can follow the same order as before. Thomas first and Ambassador Minuto Rizzo then. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question, Ivan. On the contradiction you have pointed out, you know, this feeling of threats and this ambition in soft power. I think it is the core issue, because as Ambassador reminded at the beginning with the Nice summits more than 20 years ago, the level of ambitions were higher. Now we are in a situation, you know, it was reminded, but Europeans were supposed at that time to be able to project more than 60,000 troops. Now the level of ambition, there is absolutely no European army able to project more, I would say 5,000 troops to some extent. So it's in itself, these two figures reflects, you know, the disconnect between the ambitions and the means in a situation in which European countries, if you gather all the military spendings, that is around 200 billion a year. This disconnect is a shame in a sense. You know, the fact that Europeans were not able by themselves to operate in Kabul last summer, it's a shame. And it's completely, in a sense, it's reflecting the failure of what was initiated, you know, by the political security committee. It's a common failure, I would say, which is detrimental for Europeans. In the same time, you have, I would say, regional power, which are now capable to deploy 60,000 troops abroad. Have a look about Turkey, for instance. So to respond to your question about relation with Africa or what you said Mediterranean, I would try to segment maybe a little bit. But in my opinion, the Europeans are more and more put away from Le Levant and from the Eastern Mediterranean part in pure military terms. So you have the Russian Navy, you have the Iranian, which are more and more present. You have Turkey, which is more and more ambitious, not only in Eastern Mediterranean, but also in Libya and in Africa. So to some extent, we are already facing a sort of US withdrawal from the Mediterranean Sea and a sort of US lack of importance in Africa. So for Europeans, that's something completely unusual, just to be asked to think in security terms by themselves in a situation in which the US, for instance, that's the case regarding the relation with Turkey, just say that that's precisely the type of issue you should be able to deal by yourself. And Europeans are not able to do so. After many decades of and so many discussion, political, military discussion. The problem is that simultaneously you have this ambition for soft power, but you know, if you refer to the concept of soft power by Joseph Nye, there is no soft power without hard power. It is a balance between the two things, and to believe that it's only possible to exist through a soft power is, in my opinion, obviously something attractive, but it's a sort of illusion, I think. Now, regarding the transatlantic relations, I'll let the ambassador elaborate further on that because given his experience, but I would like to draw your attention about a recent event, which is, in my view, is very important. It is the new Trade and Technological Council between the US and the EU, which was initiated in Petersburg in last September. That leads to a fundamental issue for Europeans. It is the issue of technological transfer, and military alliance. And in a sense, as I said previously, I think that we are in a situation, especially after the Trump administration period, in a situation in which the transatlantic relation is narrower because it is demanded by the majority of European countries.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Ambassador?
Well, again, we are speaking about many things at the same time because you are asking us perhaps too many questions, for 10 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Because we are talking about completely different issues. And of course, when you have a good intellectual discussion, you are interested in developing it. So it's perfectly understandable. I'm not criticizing you for that at all. So to start where Professor Gobin started, yes, she's right. Europe is politically living, not only the Levant, but I'm afraid also the rest of North Africa, unfortunately. It's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. And, the question immediately is what you can do to change that. Right? Because this is a pity, in fact. It's really a big pity. I think that, we should reinforce the cohesion of the Union. If we don't start from there, it will be very difficult to have a serious foreign policy, unless the countries of the European Union are really united by something else than, that disliking, I don't know, the Russians or Lukashenko or whatever, but something more than that. And perhaps, you will not be surprised by this, even if it's not politically correct. I think probably the enlargement was too quick. Too much too quickly, and so to come from 15 to 25 or whatever, it's big, and of course there are different views because even look, it is a strange thing, frankly, and I don't have an answer for that honestly. But if you look at a map of Europe today and you look at the contagion of COVID, you will see that what Rumsfeld called old Europe is in fact much safer than the new Europe, using again Rumsfeld language, perhaps is not the best one. But you see that there are even cultural differences there, important ones, in the way we deal with the pandemic. The rate of vaccination in my country is about 90%, I think, like France, like Spain, like Germany, more or less. If you go to Eastern Europe, again, I'm not criticizing anybody because it's not certainly their fault. It just happens to be like that. You have a country even bordering with Italy, which our vaccination is over 40% or 30% or something like that. So you see there is a cultural difference. So it is important that we reinforce this European cohesion, because if something came out of all the crises that we are facing, the climate change and the energy crisis and all that, is that a united Europe is very important. United as much as possible, of course. I don't mean to be a federal state, but, it is very important because we live in a fragmented world, and there must be some point where there is, how can I say, something fixed. And so this is why also I am in favor of the transatlantic bond, because whatever you say, and of course the professor is not wrong when he speaks about America, but nevertheless, it happens that if we look at the world, Europe and North America, in a way or in another, are more connected than other regions of the world. And so it is better to keep it rather than to lose it, Let's put it that way, in a pragmatic way. So what will happen in the future in 5 years, we don't know. But let's try to take advantage of that. And then, of course, there is this point, very important point, that I think we all have touched upon, soft power and how you use soft power, what you mean by soft power. There is the technological aspect, the strategic autonomy. We all agree as Europeans that is an important thing to do. No discussion about that. We should go quickly and further. Okay. But it does not solve the problem of what kind of relation with the rest of the world. So I think that perhaps we should go back to some rules of the past which have been forgotten, because I remember that when I was again an Italian diplomat dealing, as a young person in a European context, I mean, not in Italian context, in a European context, together with France, Germany, and the others, towards the Maghreb countries. The kind of assistance that we were developing was, how can I say, a sort of joint enterprise, where you ask the countries to have some objectives, you support the objectives, but then in the end, you look if the objectives were reached or not. Now, I'm not in that business anymore, but from what I'm told by friends, from what I understand, in fact, what we are doing in Europe, is that we are giving a certain amount of money to each country, and then at the end of the year, the country says where the money has been spent, which to me is not sufficient, frankly speaking. And then if you go down more to Africa, that's even more serious, because the Arab countries, the Maghreb, in a way or in another, I think are connected very much with Europe, in a way or in another. But if we go more south into the Sahel and Nigeria, etc., then you see that the European policy is very difficult, because you give a lot of money, but you don't know exactly to whom you give the money, and perhaps the wrong people. And there is the more we see the situation in the Sahel, for instance, is that the population is more and more detached from the governments. So there is something there. This is, the limit of what I know. So I cannot, give you an easy solution to that. But certainly we have to think much more in terms of how the population see the relationship of Europe with their governments.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I would like to shortly go back to the title of our session, The Future of Europe in the Post-COVID Geopolitical Arena. And the assumption behind this title is that the COVID is somehow accelerating and giving rise to a new world somehow. This is also implied, Thomas, in your use of the term techno-sanitary crisis. Somehow this has accelerated the technological transformation and is producing a lot of technological consequences. My question is in the field of geopolitics. To which extent this new world is a plausible hypothesis, or maybe we are actually not entering a post-COVID era, but we are in the COVID era, one with or without COVID, but one characterized by increasing instability in many areas of the world, by deglobalization and fragmentation, as the ambassador mentioned, closure of borders and so on, and by less multilateralism as features of the global arena. I don't have an answer, but I would like yours to these two hypotheses. Are we giving rise to a new world, or have we entered a darker geopolitical era somehow? Maybe we can invest the order so that the ambassador can start.
Well, you asked me a very difficult question.
I know.
If I had the answer to what you ask, I would be the wisest man on earth. So again, like as a modest human being, I try to have my 1.5 kilos of brain at your disposal, and I would say that things will change, because I think that when there are big crises in the world, we have seen the two, I speak as a European, the two world wars, for instance, after each of the two wars, there has been an enormous change in our societies, in our economies, in our ideologies, in our way of thinking, etc., etc. And this COVID scenario, in a society which is a developed society, and I'm not speaking only about Europe, a society where citizens are knowledgeable, they know what is happening, and they know what is happening elsewhere in other parts of the world. It was not the case before with the previous pandemics, absolutely so. So I think that there will be a change in the way we think about that, and perhaps it will be in the sense that we understand that multilateralism, we use a better word if you like, acting together serves our purpose much better than going fragmented. But here I would like to stop for a moment, because there is one important thing, as a human person, as a perhaps modest intellectual, trying to say, because one thing is the issue, okay? Climate change is an issue, COVID is an issue, the development of weapons of mass destruction, just to name another one, is an issue, okay? But the important thing is that we have to convince the actors, and which are the governments, in fact, today, at least in our society, that what it is important is to address the issue as such, and not at what it is perceived as the national interest in the issue. This is a big point, that is very difficult to solve. But of course, it is very important, because it is a natural tendency, because we all come from a national experience, in our society, in our age. And so every country, in every discussion, tends to see what is the best advantage on that issue. And the solving of the issue sometimes suffers because of that. This is, I think, is a very important thing. I will give you just one example for this, coming from my personal experience. I have been involved for many years in European affairs in the Italian Foreign Service, and dealing with my colleagues of other countries, of course, all the time. I'm going to Brussels all the time, to Paris, elsewhere. And I remember that at least until the 80s, there was the sense that you should, how can I say, make a progress in the issue. That if Italy was losing a few millions in a deal, okay, too bad, but it was not so important. It was more important to progress in that issue and to build something useful to everybody. As this is perhaps it has been lost a little bit. I don't know. It's a question again for everybody. But I think that to look at national interest only in a narrow sense is not really helping the world, the big issues facing us.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Thomas.
I agree with Ambassador, and I will try to elaborate in a slightly different field. First observation, I remember in April 2020, I was invited on a TV show, and I said at that time, in August 1914, when people went to the front in Europe, they didn't know that the war will last 4 years. So just to make this historical parallel, I received a lot of backlash from on the social media. But the problem is that, what is completely unexpected, it is the duration of this crisis. And as you said in your initial remarks, is it the fifth wave? Is it the fourth one? But the point is that the new normal is certainly to have these waves, I would say, for a long time. So that's the first point I wanted to make, and that leads to a situation which is completely new, in the sense that, for instance, for France, it's different in other European countries. It's related to our political organization, but we are from a situation of security emergency, état d'urgence sécuritaire, related to the terrorist attack we suffered in 2015. And we moved to a situation of sanitary urgency, with all its consequences in terms of legislation, and a very deep and quick evolution of the notion of public liberties, of individual liberties. People are now living and accept, some rules which would have been said as completely unacceptable only 3 years after. That means that, the situation creates a political response. And that's something very new for Europeans. because they had the luxury of stability since many decades. But this luxury, to some extent, is evaporating in a sense. So just to be focused on Europe, but we put, of course, think about that for other areas. That leads me to two other observations to know if we are moving from a new world. There is this idea of acceleration of things which were already visible, but which are accelerated by the pandemics in terms, for instance, of power redistribution. But in my opinion, there is something very, very important. It's I touched upon in my initial remarks. It is the new centrality of digital platforms. The fact that they are more and more asked to provide tools for public policies, and at the same time, it is more and more obvious that these digital platforms are related to, on the one hand, the US authorities, and on the other hand, on Chinese authorities. And the problem for Europeans, but elsewhere in the world, it is to depend on this digital platforms. You know, for instance, in Europe, there was an attempt to create a service for health data, and it was not possible to make it, you know, with pure European tools, because to some extent we depend, to put things very bluntly, and it should be more described, but you see the idea. We depend on the US cloud. So that leads to something also maybe new. It is in terms of I would say sociological transformation. We learn to work in different ways. So it is maybe the first step to sort of, I would say, virtual migrations. We are in a situation in which a lot of tertiary activities can be done by workers, living outside Europe, because of the what is offered by technology. So in that sense, I think that this crisis is at the same time reflecting things already visible before the pandemics, but this pandemics for sure has accelerated some trends.
Thank you very much. I would like to put two last rounds of discussion, and then, of course, offer you a last point if you wish to. First, just on very concrete tools for this geopolitical repositioning of the European Union in the global arena. The last novelties we have had is, on the one hand, the EU strategic compass, which is still under discussion. On the other hand, the whole discussion without many instruments actually on European strategic autonomy, not only in the field of security, but also economic and technological strategic autonomy, as you mentioned, Thomas. Do you think that these tools or these debates are just news of the day, or do they have the power to make things move in the near future in view of this post-COVID geopolitical arena? And maybe we can again change, and we can start by Thomas and continue by Ambassador Minuto Rizzo.
Well, on strategic autonomy, there are so many things which were said that it's difficult to clarify, but maybe it's important to make a distinction between three levels. Strategic autonomy should be observed in terms of making decision process and the ability to have your own intelligence to make proper decision. So on that, Europeans have some tools to try to assess by themselves a strategic situation, even if it's not possible for each topic, and there are some topics in which it's very difficult to have their own intelligence. Related to that, the ability for Europeans to continue to be an actor, in the outer space is absolutely crucial, especially the ability to keep this ability to send by itself, satellites or microsatellites. The second level, it is in terms of operation, and there is no real appetite, in fact, from European countries, even if there are interesting evolution, for instance, in Sahel. It was something which was actively promoted by France, which is also created a lot of discussion, for instance, in Morocco or in Algeria. But to some extent, there are some elements of cooperation, even if in terms of magnitude, it's rather limited. And you have the level of I would say industry. And on that, it's always difficult because there are pure economic and technological interests, but there are some moves which were made. So I think that we should not be completely obsessed by this wording of strategic autonomy. It is something on which Europeans are more or less uncomfortable with when they discuss with the US. And it's interesting to observe that, this notion has moved to another one, which in my view, by the way, is more difficult to establish, but which is technological sovereignty, which is something larger, not only concentrated on defense and security. And on that, yes, we have observed some move. Just an example, the agreement between China and the EU decided in December 2020 is blocked at the time being because there is no reciprocity coming from China. Just one example.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Well, strategic autonomy is, it has just been said, is a very vague concept. You can understand in the end, the philosophical meaning of it. Okay, that we understand what it means. How you decline it in terms of practical actions is completely different. So if you speak about strategic autonomy in the sense that some European countries think that we should close the links that we have with the United States and Canada and just go alone in the world as a sort of European power, then I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that for one simple reason, that we don't have the force to do it anyway. So why should we aim at this? We don't have the capacity of being an actor of this kind. If you speak about strategic autonomy, when you think about certain important things like space, like high technologies, like big platforms, where there should be more of a European presence, then of course I'm very much in favor, because that's very reasonable to do, and will certainly improve the influence of Europe in the world. What again, I don't want to ruin, the discussion, saying that this is the objective is very good. But again, individual countries should not be afraid to try, should not be trying to use this argument to their advantage. Of course, there are industrial issues, and it is perfectly normal that each industry tries to have the best. This is normal. but there should be some kind of political coordination where you really look at the final objective. Like space, for instance, space is a great idea, And there is a lot of European cooperation, by the way, in space, and we should improve it. But we should not at the same time have one country, using it to be more important. That would be, I think, not useful, frankly, because then the others understand it and then they use something contrary. If you take, for instance, defense industry, again, this is another case, if you like. Defense industry alliances in Europe sometimes are strange. You have, I don't want to enter into this argument now, but you have alliances a la carte, too much. We should have much more of a European industry where, defense industry, where we have the same products, but not a multiplication just to suit specific industrial interest. Again, it's a complicated issue. I say, yes, strategic autonomy, but be careful by what we mean by strategic autonomy.
Thank you very much. I will conclude my questions with the most difficult one, Ambassador, for both of you, because I think in this, as you have mentioned, intellectual debate on the wide implications of COVID and European integration developments for the future positioning of Europe in the world, it is important not to lose the policy approach. So I would like to ask you a very simple question to put and very difficult to answer, of course, which is, what should Europe do in order to better take advantage of the opportunities? Both of you have mentioned that COVID has brought some opportunities in your interventions. So what should Europe do, the European Union in particular, do to, you have mentioned, Ambassador, some issues, more cohesion, but this is, again, also easier said than done within the European Union. So in terms of policy, I take your answer on the EU strategic compass, your silence on them, as an answer to my question. So in which fields the European Union should invest efforts and capacities in order to better capture the opportunities this pandemic and this crisis of the global world as we knew it until 2020 is offering. Maybe Tomás, then Mr. Minuto Rizzo, and then we will close the session.
Yes, indeed, Ivan, it's an uneasy question. Three things. The first one, it is very important in my view in the current context that European country, European society think about their cohesion. Because without cohesion, it's simply not possible just to pretend to exist outside the EU. Second, I think that the main challenge is in fact the ability for Europe to improve its productive apparatus, its industry. And to do so, there is a strong need, a sort of urgency to master what is called, industrial data, to avoid the situation in which many European industry could become directly or indirectly some of subcontractors from digital platforms. And that leads me to the third point, which is a strong investment on education and on youth. The problem, we have an aging population, and the pandemic crisis was a sort of protection, of the people, which is, in my view, very positive. What was made, to defend the economy and also to protect people, but at the same time, it was certainly down more or less at the expense of the youth. So as soon as it is possible, there is a need to invest on education very, very strongly.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Ambassador?
I don't know how to answer that in a serious way, because it's, you know, it's a very large question. What I can say in terms also of what I've seen by my personal experience is that for many decades, Europe has undoubtedly progressed, but it was also always the governments who were in charge, and the population was really outside it because it was not considered to be an essential part of it. So I feel that part of the popular movement, souverainism, whatever you want to call it, is also due to the fact that many people in our countries don't understand exactly what Europe means, and they have also sometimes the wrong information. So certainly the most important thing is to invest in the youth, and they are already the most European of all. And then the second thing is, and perhaps the COVID should end soon, should try to have the most out of the present, I don't know if it is called convention or whatever it is, the way this exercise, which is going out now, started last year, but has little publicity because of the COVID, the pandemic, where we try really to have more of a Europe of the future based on the common will of the citizens. This, I think, will be the key in the end.
No, this is very interesting. We have started to discuss the geopolitical projection of Europe, and then both of you actually conclude that in order to strengthen Europe's position in the world, it has to deepen the process of integration through increased cohesion, more industrial productive development, more investment in youth, and as you said, more democracy at the end, more involvement of societies and people in Europe, and I find this extremely interesting. So we are coming to the close of this session. I don't think we can draw conclusions. This was not the idea to start with, but I think it has been obvious through our discussions that we are at the crossroads. Europe is at the crossroads, partly because of the pandemic, partly, as Thomas mentioned, because of developments that were already there before. The rest of the world is at the crossroads on the geopolitical arena. And of course, the relations with Southern Mediterranean countries and African countries of Europe are at the crossroads. And here we can only go on thinking and discussing and trying to find out our European way through it. I will let you a final word, each of you, if you wish, Thomas.
Well, just before joining this session, you know, I have organized at E3 a session with Sandrine Godin, which is Secrétaire Générale des Affaires Européennes, who is preparing the French presidency for the next 6 months. And she insisted also on the need to use this presidency in continuation with the Slovene one and in preparation with the other one, to increase and to improve, you know, the relation between African countries and Europe. And I think, given, you know, this also this raising importance of the Atlantic dialogue, I think it's something on which jointly we should try to discuss during the coming months.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Well, I also think that the relationship with Africa will be extremely important in our future, because of course China in the Pacific, we know all the issues, but Africa is something touching directly us because of history and because of economy and also because of proximity. And we should do certainly more. We should probably change our mindset about Africa, because up to now we have worked with good faith very often, but with very traditional tools. And we should change that. And I'm also wondering why we should not have a sort of very big Africa Foundation in Brussels where, everybody is represented with a lot of money, where we have continuous discussion, where we understand each other more, This is
Thank
what I
you very
think.
much. With this call to continue discussions, to change our mindset, and to engage in a more systematic way with Africa, we close this session. So on behalf of the Policy Center for the New South, it doesn't remain to me but to thank you both, Ambassador Thomas, for your contribution to this session, and hoping to see you again in further sessions of the Atlantic Dialogues. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.